Hello, welcome to KDO Studio Introduction to Reversible Stitches. I'm Laura Barker and this is a portion of a class I like to teach. Some projects like scarves and blankets are nicer when they're reversible. How often have you spent time trying to carefully tie your hand knit scarf around your neck with only the right side showing? This is how you can avoid that. Ribbing and garter stitch can easily create reversible fabrics, but there are so many more possibilities. Today we're going to talk about knit and purl variations, cable variations, and lace variations. We'll look at one of each. Because I prefer not to have so many small samples with limited future use, I'm creating a sampler scarf and adding new reversible stitch patterns as I find or create them. Worked in worsted yarn, the width of the scarf is about 4.5 inches, but grab any yarn you'd like to use and appropriately sized needles. I'll be giving both charted and written directions as I go, but let's take a look at what you may see in the charts. Very standard and open box means to knit on the right side or purl on the wrong side. A line, which is typical in Japanese knitting, means to purl on the right side and knit on the wrong side. Knit two together is a right slanting decrease. Knit in front and back is one type of increase. A null stitch is literally a stitch that isn't there, and it goes with either an increase or a decrease. SSK is a left slanting decrease, and yarn over is a type of increase. So if you are working along and making a scarf, I cast on 24 stitches. I happen to use long tail cast on, but any cast on will work. And I worked 4 rows of garter stitch. Now there's several things I want to point out before we get going on the pattern. First of all, I would recommend putting a stitch marker right here on the front. While once the scarf is done, the fact that you can't tell the front and the back apart is really fabulous. It's not a good attribute while you're working. So putting this on the front will help you keep the right side and the wrong side straight. Because I cast on with the long tail cast on, that also means after 4 rows, my tail is to the right. But if you want to rely on that, I would suggest writing that down. Now, the 3 stitches at each edge represent the border, the garter stitch border, and those will continue in the same way going forward. The patterns, as I give them to you, will not include these outside stitches. So less those 6 stitches, the pattern will be the 18 stitches in the middle. Now, unless you're very sure that you will remember to keep those 3 selvage stitches straight, say that 3 times fast, then I recommend putting a stitch marker in 3 stitches from each border. Finally, when I am working my garter stitch, the edge I like is a slip stitch edge. So I slip the first stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, and then I move the yarn to the back, and that gives me this nice chained selvage edge. So with all of that said, if you're ready to go, we will look at the first pattern. Now this is a relatively straightforward knit and purl stitch. And so we will start with a seed stitch section, a ribbed section, and another seed stitch section. And then after 6 rows, we will flip that and have ribbing, seed stitch, ribbing. So looking at the directions, on rows 1, 3, and 5, that's the right side. For the seed stitch, we will purl 1, knit 1 3 times, the first 6 stitches. We will knit 1, purl 1 3 times for the ribbing, and then we'll go back to the purl 1, knit 1 for the seed stitch again. The even rows, the wrong side rows, will all be knit 1, purl 1 across. Now I want you to notice also that I did put a repeat line in here, which is 12 stitches by 12 rows. So we've got a repeat of 12 stitches plus the extra 6 to make the pattern symmetrical with the seed stitch at the sides. But because the repeat is 12 stitches, if you wanted to widen this for a blanket or for anything else, you could add 12 stitches, 24 stitches, or any multiple of 12 stitches to make this pattern work. I knit continental, it doesn't matter how you knit. I'm going to, as I mentioned, slip the first stitch purlwise with the yarn in front and then take the yarn to knit. And I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches. And there I am, there's my stitch marker. And so now it's time to work 6 stitches of seed stitch, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. So purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit. And now that we've knit those 6 stitches, we're ready to work the rib stitches, which are going to be knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And then with 6 stitches left, back to seed stitch, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and with any luck, yes, there we are, back to our stitch marker and 3 last stitches. So I slip the stitch marker and I knit the last 3 stitches, which is what I do at the end of every row for the selvage. Now, I'm going to turn this over to the wrong side because our stitch marker is now on the back. And 2 things. One, I like to always tell my students that even if it's easy, the back is not a reason to stop paying attention or take a little snooze. It is a good opportunity to double check your work. Also, the selvage stitches, I'm going to talk you through them the beginning here, but after that I am not going to talk about them every single time. It's kind of like the difference between the recipe for the cake and the recipe for the icing. We don't talk about the icing all the time while we're baking the cake. So here's our little icing. Slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, knit the other 2. That's how we start every single selvage row, right side or wrong side. Slip the stitch marker. Now the first 6 stitches are seed stitch. So the knit, purl should not stack up. You should be knitting into purls and purling into knits. And if you look, that's what you have. So go ahead and knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And then we're still going to knit, purl, but now we're in the ribbing section. You will see that the knits and the purls do align. So go ahead and finish off this row and then work these first 2 rows 2 more times to complete the bottom half of this pattern. All right, after working 6 rows in this pattern, you can now see you have seed stitch here, you have ribbing in the middle, you have seed stitch here, and of course garter borders on the edges, and we're on the right side. But if we flip it over, you will see that we have exactly the same thing, seed stitch, ribbing, seed stitch. And so we now move on to the second rows of the pattern. And so the even rows don't change, but for the odd right side rows, we have first ribbing, then seed stitch, then ribbing again. And so the ribbing is knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. The seed stitch is purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and the ribbing is again knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. So after my edge stitches, I'm switching to ribbing, so these actually will stack up. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And then now we want seed stitch, and so these will not stack up. Purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, and then back to ribbing, which is going to be knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, and slip, and finish. And once again, on the wrong side row, it will be knit, purl all the way across our pattern section. On the sides where we have ribbing, the knits and purls will stack, but the middle 6 stitches, which are seed stitch, we will knit into the purls and purl into the knits, but it's knit, purl all the way across. So once you have worked your wrong side row, you will then repeat those 2 rows 2 more times for 6 rows with the pattern reversed. Now I have worked rows 7 through 12 and then also added 4 rows of just straight garter stitch knitting back and forth to complete this section, and you will see that you're developing a nice little checkerboard section here with the seed stitch and the rib stitch. And so you could continue that for as long as you would like. And of course, it is exactly the same on the back. So now we are ready to move on to the cable pattern. Cable patterns are generally made reversible by turning them into ribbed cables. So every knit of a cable now becomes a knit purl pair, which means each of your cables is going to be double the size that you might expect. This increases your stitch count, but it doesn't increase the width. And so we start with some increases so that the scarf can be consistent. And really, unless you have an unusual border or no border at all, you're still going to need increases at the beginning and the end to account for this shrinking of width caused by both cables and ribbing. So for this variation, we're going to have a 4-stitch cable on each end, 3-stitch garter panels in between. That's a common choice to make it reversible if you are going to have space between the cables. And then we're going to have an 8-stitch cable in the middle. Now, I like the nomenclature and the symbols that Lucy Hague, H-A-G-U-E, uses for her cables. If you've never seen her work, there are a lot of unusual cables and it's beautiful. So for the 4-stitch cables, this is what we see in the pattern, in the graph, in the diagram. And in the written abbreviations, it's C4R, cable 4 right. And so the slant of our cable is going to go to the right. And then once we've done that, we knit 1, purl 1 2 times. That's the short hand. Long hand, you slip the next 2 stitches to the cable needle and hold to the back. That's how we get our right cross. And then we knit 1, purl 1 from the left needle, and then we knit 1, purl 1 from the cable needle. When we get to the cable 8 right, so this is 8 stitches involved, and then it's a knit 1, purl 1 4 times with the cross. That's the shorthand. Longwise, we slip the next 4 stitches to the cable needle and hold to the back. We knit 1, purl 1 2 times from the left needle, and then we knit 1, purl 1 2 times from the cable needle. I don't like my cables to be too close to the edge, so I generally add a little bit of extra at the bottom and the top. And so this repeat is actually 8 rows from row 3 through row 10 inclusive. And so if you were going to work more of this pattern than just the 13 rows, you would actually work rows 1 and 2, the increase in the setup, and then you would work rows 3 through 10 as many times as you wanted, and then go back, and then at just one final time work rows 11, 12, and 13. You will need a cable needle for this section. I do sometimes work small cables without a cable needle, but with ribbed cables, I find that stitches want to get out of order or disappear, and also because they generally have twice as many stitches, they can get really large, and so particularly with 8 stitches, I'm not going to think about cabling without a cable needle. So starting with the selvage, and then as soon as I get into this, I'm going to knit front and back first. I have this on the diagram here, knit front and back. And this gray stitch is just what we call a null stitch. That means there was no stitch there. Now, sometimes you don't want to use a knit front and back because you can see a bump in your work, but in this case, the knit is a knit, and then when we knit into the back and make the bump, that's where a purl is going to be anyway. So we have a knit into the front of the stitch, and then into the back of the stitch, and then we have a knit purl. So these are the four stitches now, are our cable on the right. Then we knit 3. That's our garter stitch section. Then we have an additional knit front and back. Then we have knit, purl, knit, purl, and then we're going to have another knit front and back. Into the front and into the back. And then we're going to have 3 knits for our garter stitch. 1, 2, 3. And then we're going to have a knit purl. And then into that last stitch before the selvage, we have 1 last knit front and knit into the back. Now, all of the wrong side rows, you're going to knit 1, purl 1 2 times. That's your cable. You're going to knit 3. That's your garter. You're going to knit 1, purl 1 4 times. That's your second cable panel. And then you're going to knit 3, second garter stitch, and then knit 1, purl 1 2 times for your final cable panel. As we work across the back, let's notice not so much the very first stitch because that was an increase, but the first 4 knit, purl, knit, purl, that's cabling, and so those should start stacking up to make our cables, our ribbed cables. And then the next 3 are garter stitch, so we're knitting into purls. 1, 2, 3. And then we will knit purl 4 times to set up the center cable, knit 3 for the garter, and then work our final cable panel and selvage. After knitting rows 1 and 2, the pattern is starting to set up, but it's still a little hard to see. Row 3, remember this is a symmetrical pattern, so row 3 is actually the same as all of those even rows. You knit 1, purl 1 2 times for the first cable section, knit 3 for garter, knit 1, purl 1 4 times for the central cable, knit 3 for garter, knit 1, purl 1 2 times for the final cable. So work rows 3 and 4 following those directions. Having now worked through row 4, you can start to see the pattern emerge. So you see it only looks like you have 2 because of the ribbing here, but this is 1 cable panel, garter stitch, your larger cable, garter, and your smaller cable, on the other end. Now, all the rows are basically the same except for when you cable. And so on row 5, it's the first time we're going to cable, and we're only cabling the outside smaller cables. So there, instead of knit, purl, you take the first 2 stitches, you slide them to the back, and then you work the second 2 stitches, the second pair, and then come back to the first pair. You'll knit straight across the middle cable, just like you've been doing. 3 garter stitch, 3 knits, then knit, purl 8, then 3, and then you'll cable again on the side. Now I'm ready to work my first cable watch this little stitch marker because it's just kind of hanging out there. But I take my first 2 stitches and slide them onto the cable needle, and that's a knit 1, purl 1 pair. And then it has to go to the back, and it needs to go under your working yarn, and you still have to hold on to this. And then knit 1, purl 1. And then you've got to find your cable needle again, slide it around. Even knitting continental, it may be easier to switch to throwing just for this cable needle. I learned throwing, so sometimes I revert. Knit, it's a little bit tight. Knit and purl. And then I will go back to my knit 3 and then knit, purl 8 stitches and then knit 3 and work 1 more cable. And then of course you work back just the way you do on every wrong side row. Having worked rows 5 and 6, it's now time to work row 7. And on row 7, the outside cables do not get cabled because of course they just got cabled. You can see them right here, but the center will get cabled. And so that's the only part that changes in the directions. So after selvage, knit 1, purl 1 2 times, knit 3, we're going to cable the next 8, knit 3, and then knit, purl 2 times. On row 7, now that I have worked the first 7 stitches, it's time to cable the middle cable. And so sliding 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches. It's just twice as big. Knit, purl, 2 pairs, and bring that around to the back, the cable needle, and then knit, purl, knit, purl, and then pull the pull the cable needle, and we're going to work these stitches as well. Knit, purl. When I throw my Fitbit catches the frame. Knit and purl. And then finish off the row, the last 7 stitches with your knit 3, and then knit, purl the pairs, and then work across the back again. Now that we have cabled the central panel on row 7 and worked back across row 8, you can really start to see the cable pattern developing here. So we now move on to row 9, and row 9 is exactly the same as row 5. We're going to be working the smaller cables on the side, but working straight across ribbing on the central cable. When we finish that, we will then work back across row 10. Now do remember that if you were going to keep going with these cables, this would be the end of the repeat and you would go back to row 3. But since we are not, we will move on to 11, that is the same as a wrong side row, and row 12, which, because it is a wrong side row, is a wrong side row. So go ahead and work those 4 rows. As you can see, your cables look just lovely. As a matter of fact, if you didn't know, you might not even know that they were ribbed, but the proof is in turning them over, because you look at the other side and it looks just the same. Now, if you remember at the beginning of this, we increased 4 stitches to make the width consistent, and I think you will see that that was pretty successful. And so if we had 4 fewer stitches, it would have drawn it in the scarf and it would have had a bowed effect. But because we have these 4 extra stitches, now that we're not going to be having ribbed cables, it's time to take those out. And so everywhere we did a knit front and back to increase on row 1, on row 13, we're going to do an SSK decrease to take that stitch back out again. And if you'll look, they're straight up. So directly above the knit front and back, directly above the knit front and back in each place. We're taking it out. Now, the SSK is just a left-leaning decrease rather than the knit two together, which is a right-leaning decrease. But in this case, it's important. We want to bring the knit over the purl stitch rather than pulling the purl over the knit stitch. Now, once we work across this, so we're going to SSK, and then that stitch is now gone, and we're going to knit 5, and then we're going to SSK, that stitch is now gone, we knit 4, SSK, and then knit 5, SSK, and then we will have gotten rid of those 4 extra stitches. That's actually also going to be the first row of our garter. So once you have worked those few decreases, go ahead and work 3 rows, only 3 rows of knit all garter stitch this time to complete this section. Before we move to our final lace variation, let's talk a little bit about cables. And so we've talked some about it, but basically in order to convert a cable pattern into reversible, there are 2 things you need to do, or I guess 3 technically, but you need to convert the cables into ribbed cables, and that is doubling the number of stitches. And so you might have to play around with it a little bit, but I have found that in general, for every 2 knit stitches that I'm turning into 4, I'm going to need to increase 1 stitch. And so if you remember, we increased 1 stitch here, and we increased 2 here, 1 in each 4 section, and then 1 stitch over here. And then of course your background or anything that's not cabled needs to also be reversible. So you can play with ribbing, seed stitch, or even perhaps something else, or work your cables with no filler in between. Our final reversible pattern is a lace variation, and this is bird's eye lace. It's an old Scottish pattern. The simplest way to make lace, and I will say nearly reversible, is to make it garter stitch by knitting the wrong side rows instead of purling them. Under close scrutiny, it is possible to see a small difference, but anyone who can see that is too close. Most reversible lace is thicker or less fine than traditional lace. Because bird's eye is an old Scottish pattern, it is a pattern that was meant to be memorized, so you could just carry it in your head when you went out into the field or wherever you went. Not much was written down. And traditionally, the first row is actually a wrong side row. So technically, we're working the wrong side first. And also, in the traditional version, all of the decreases are knit 2 together. However, anybody who's knit lace, it's just really hard to work that knit 2 together on the other side, on the far side of the yarn over. The SSK is kind of intuitive, so that's what I'm going to go with. You will notice that this is just a 4-stitch pattern. So because we are 18 stitches wide, we will do 4 repeats of 4 and then 2 extra stitches on the end of knit 2 together, double yarn over, SSK. And then as we come back, it will be basically a garter stitch pattern, but we'll be knitting until we get to the double yarn over, and into the double yarn over, it will be knit 1, purl 1, because of course that's on the wrong side row, and then knit. So you're not going to be able to use stitch markers here with these double yarn overs, and also the repeat is staggered because on rows 3 and 4, it just gets shifted over 2 stitches, and it always needs to be staggered. So if you had an even multiple of 4 instead of a multiple of 4 plus 2, on row 1, the pattern would go all the way across, and then on rows 3 and 4, you would need both the extra 2 stitches at the front end, but you would also need them at the back end to keep that staggered pattern. If you're looking very carefully, you may notice that I have switched to more pointed needles for lace work. This always helps with any increases and decreases. And so I'm following the pattern, knit 2 together, yarn over once, yarn over twice, and SSK. Again, knit 2 together, yarn over twice, and SSK. And keep doing that until the end of the row, and you should wind up with just 2 stitches, which are going to be plain knits. On row 2, it's basically garter stitch, except for when you hit the double yarn over, you will knit and purl into those yarn overs. So knit 2, those are our edge stitches. This knit was a decrease, and now I've got my first double yarn over. So I'm going to knit into it, and the first yarn over will drop off, but hold on to the second yarn over. Bring your yarn to the front and purl into the front. Knit 2, and then you hit another double yarn over, knit and purl, and continue like that all the way across. Now you can see that our double yarn over has created a little bit larger than your standard lace hole, as you would expect. Row 3 is just like row 1, except staggered 2 stitches. And so this is a good place also to learn to read your knitting a little bit. We don't want the new yarn overs to come directly over the old yarn overs, and as you see, the first knit stitch is over a knit stitch, and the second knit stitch is over the first half of this double yarn over, and then the knit 2 together will come over the other half of this double yarn over. So knit 2, and then we start our repeat. Same repeat, knit 2 together. Now notice that our double yarn over is coming between 2 adjacent stitches, no holes underneath. Double yarn over, SSK, knit 2, double yarn over, SSK, and we will continue that across to the end of the row. And then when we work the wrong side row, again, everything will be garter stitch except for when we knit and purl into the double yarn over. And that is actually the whole pattern. After I work row 4, then I'm going to repeat these 4 rows 2 more times. It's up to you. I have now worked 12 rows of the garter stitch lace, the bird's eye lace, and then 4 rows of just garter stitch on top to complete this section of my sampler scarf. So if you want to try converting another lace pattern, the easy way to do it is to try knitting back across the wrong side row. Give it a try and see what you think. If you're like me, I like to read stitch pattern books the way some people read cookbooks, just looking for something new to try. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to reversible stitches. Thanks again to KDO Studio for providing the platform. If you'd like to see more about me or my work, you can find me on social media. I hope to see you next year live at KDO, and in the meantime, wishing health to you and yours.